My name is Clara Thorne. I'm 28 years old, and just a few months ago, I was standing on the graduation stage at Northwood University, receiving my master's degree in sustainable design to the quiet, heartfelt applause of my closest friends. It should have been one of the most luminous days of my life, a summit I had spent nearly a decade of tireless work and study to reach. But like every significant milestone before it, that moment felt incomplete. It was missing the people I was supposed to be able to call my family. From the time I was a child, I understood my role in our small, sun-bleached house. I was the anchor, the one who yielded to keep the waters calm, the one endlessly measured against Sophie. My sister, 3 years younger, was the sail, catching every favorable wind my parents could blow her way. Arthur and Helen Thorne, my parents, live in Crestfall Bay, a quiet coastal town where fog rolls in like a soft gray blanket and gossip travels on the salty air from the fishing docks to the town's single bakery. To our neighbors, we were a portrait of coastal charm. My father managed a local boat supply shop, a fixture in the community for generations. My mother volunteered at the Historical Society, her hands always smelling faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Sophie and I grew up in a two-story clapboard house with blue shutters and a garden of wild hydrangeas that turned the color of the evening sky in late summer. But what the neighbors never saw was the profound imbalance within those walls. Sophie was the long-awaited light, cherished and shielded as if a harsh word might extinguish her. When Sophie declared an interest in painting, my parents converted the spare bedroom into a sunlit art studio for her. When she decided she needed a year in Florence to find her muse, they drew from their savings without a moment's hesitation. And me? I was taught that life's currents were strong and you had to learn to swim on your own. Money was a tide that ebbed and flowed, and self-reliance was the only true life raft. From the age of 16, I worked evening shifts at a waterfront diner, the smell of fried fish clinging to my clothes, saving every dollar for textbooks and tuition. Sophie never had to consider the cost of a meal, let alone an education. I used to believe this was just a difference in philosophy, that my parents were forging me into someone stronger. But over time, I saw it for what it was, a choice. And the choice was never in my favor. I still remember my undergraduate graduation. My parents arrived nearly an hour late because they had to drive Sophie to a gallery opening in the city. When I received my diploma, they snapped a few hasty photos and left before the ceremony had even concluded, murmuring something about the traffic back to the bay. The day I told them I'd been accepted into the master's program at Northwood, my father simply nodded. "Good," he said, his eyes on the television. "But don't expect us to fund it." So I didn't. I handled it all myself. I applied for every scholarship I could find, worked as a research assistant, took on freelance design projects for local businesses, and spent 2 years in a constant state of motion, juggling a full course load with more than 40 hours of work each week. On my graduation day, I knew they wouldn't be there. And as I expected, the 2 seats reserved for them sat empty. But right after the ceremony, as I was taking photos with friends on the grassy quad, my phone rang with an unknown number. The deep, steady voice of Mr. Alastair Finch, my maternal grandparents' longtime lawyer, came through the line. "Clara, your grandparents left their entire estate to you. We need to meet to discuss the details." I froze, my hand clutching the phone. It wasn't the thought of money. I had no idea of the amount, but the sudden, overwhelming weight of their trust and love. My maternal grandparents, Elias and Eleanor Vance, were the ones who had nurtured the quiet, steady parts of who I am. Their old saltbox house, with its weathered gray shingles, a wide porch overlooking the Pacific, and a rose garden that bloomed in defiant bursts of crimson and peach every summer, was my sanctuary. They lived simply but with immense care, their days filled with reading, gardening, and telling me stories of their youth in the 1950s, back when Crestfall Bay was little more than a handful of fishing shacks. When I was in high school, I spent nearly every weekend there, helping my grandfather mend the garden trellises and listening to my grandmother's quiet wisdom as we baked bread. Most importantly, I listened. It was a gift I rarely received in my own home. In their final years, as their health faded, I was the one who drove them to doctor's appointments, managed their finances, and tended to their small, daily needs. My parents and Sophie rarely visited, except for a brief appearance at Thanksgiving or Christmas, usually just long enough for a few photos to post online. So, when Mr. Finch told me they had left everything to me, I knew it wasn't an act of favoritism. It was a recognition of a bond forged over years of quiet care. A few days later, sitting in Mr. Finch's warm, book-lined office downtown, he placed a thick binder in front of me. Your grandparents' current estate is valued at approximately $1.2 million, including the house and their investment portfolio. They wanted you to have full and sole control. I sat in silence, a storm of emotions churning within me, profound gratitude, a deep, aching love, and a flicker of apprehension. When I left his office, I drove along the coastal highway back to Havenwood, the city where I lived and worked. The ocean's salty wind seemed to carry my thoughts out to the gray horizon. $1.2 million. It felt like a number from someone else's life. But I knew the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was in the years of memories, the sunlit mornings on that weathered porch, the scent of my grandmother's lavender sachets, and my grandfather's quiet chuckle as he read the morning paper. And, because I understood that, I also knew this inheritance would not remain a peaceful legacy for long. In my family, anything of value was seen as a communal resource, one they felt entitled to manage. My parents had a long history of borrowing things, money, a car, even sentimental jewelry with vague promises of return that dissolved over time. I still remember when my aunt gave them a substantial sum to invest in my father's shop. 6 months later, the shop was unchanged, the money was gone, and any mention of it was met with my mother's masterful deflection or a lecture on the impropriety of discussing money among family. With Sophie, it was different. They never had to borrow from her because, in their minds, everything was already hers by right. Her first car, her trip to Florence, the small condo in the city they'd bought as an investment, but let her live in rent-free, all happened without question. That's why the moment I signed the inheritance documents, I knew I had to move first. I couldn't wait for them to find out and then try to defend it. By then, it would be too late. I reached out to a friend from university who now worked at a prominent law firm in Havenwood. She introduced me to an attorney named Marcus Thornino Relation, a coincidence that felt like a strange sort of omen. He was a man in his 40s who spoke softly, but his eyes missed nothing. We met at a quiet cafe where he spread my file across the table. "Clara," he said, his tone calm but firm, "I've handled many estate disputes. Given your family's history, you need to secure these assets immediately. The most effective way is to place everything into an irrevocable trust." He explained the structure, a legal entity that, once established, could not be altered or revoked by me. I would serve as the trustee, the only person with authority to manage the assets. But legally, the property would no longer be in my name. Anyone searching public records would find no direct link between me and the house or the investments. I agreed on the spot. Over the next 3 weeks, we worked tirelessly. Marcus coordinated with an asset management firm to establish an LLC owned by the trust. All utilities for the house, electricity, water, property taxes, insurance were transferred to the LLC's name. The property title was updated, sealed, and stored in the law firm's vault, with digital copies kept in a secure cloud server, far from Crestfall Bay. The bank accounts my grandparents had left were closed, and the funds moved into a new account belonging to the trust, protected by multi-factor authentication accessible only by Marcus and me. I remember vividly the moment I signed the final document, my pen hovering over the words, "Irrevocable Living Trust Agreement." A wave of relief washed over me, mingled with a quiet vigilance. It felt like locking the final door between myself and the hands that had always taken so freely. I told no one. When my parents called to ask, "When are you planning to move into your grandparents' house?" their tone a casual mix of concern and probing, I simply said I was still busy settling things in Havenwood. When Sophie texted, "Have you thought about selling the place and we could split the money?" I need some capital for a new art project. I replied with a non-committal, I'm still thinking. I let them believe I had done nothing, that the inheritance was still sitting there, vulnerable. I let them underestimate me, just as they always had. In the weeks that followed, I continued my life as usual. I went to work, and on weekends, I drove to Crestfall Bay to check on the house, mow the lawn, and tend to the roses my grandmother had loved so dearly. Every time I stepped onto that porch, I felt a sense of peace, but always with a quiet warning echoing in my mind. They will come. Sooner or later, they will come. Because of that, I held my secret even tighter. I instructed Marcus to ensure that no one but me would receive any notifications related to the trust. All bills were paid online, leaving no paper trail. I even had a discreet security camera system installed, hidden among the eaves of the roof, just to be sure that if anyone decided to drop by unannounced, I would know. Once everything was in place, I felt I could breathe a little deeper. I had built a solid legal fortress around my grandparents' legacy, a fortress my family couldn't breach with a few tears or a fabricated story. But I also knew that for them, a fortress was just an invitation to find a way over the walls. And when that day came, I would be ready. In the first few months after the assets were secured in the trust, an unusual quiet settled over my interactions with my family. There were no urgent phone calls, no dramatic text messages, no surprise visits to my grandparents' house under the guise of just passing by. But this silence was not peaceful. It felt like the stillness of a deep lake just before a storm, with unseen currents churning below. Occasionally, in our brief phone calls, my mother would let drop casual-sounding remarks heavy with intent. It would only have been fair for your grandparents to leave the house to both you and your sister. Or, Sophie has so many wonderful memories there, too. You should think about sharing, so she doesn't feel left out. I would offer a non-committal neither agreeing nor disagreeing, letting them interpret my silence as uncertainty. Sophie was more direct in her own way. She began stopping by the house for the most mundane reasons, bringing me a loaf of bread from the town bakery, dropping off a box of old books Mom said she'd left at Grandma and Grandpa's. But each time, Sophie's eyes would drift past my face, scanning the bookshelves, the wall where our grandparents' wedding portrait hung, and especially the old wooden secretary desk where I kept miscellaneous papers unimportant to me, but potentially very interesting to someone searching for proof of ownership. I never left her alone in a room. When she would ask, "Do you still have the deed to the house?" I just loved to see it for old time's sake. I would smile and gently change the subject, as if I hadn't heard her. My parents also shifted their approach. After years of benign neglect, they suddenly took a keen interest in my life. One Friday evening, I received an invitation for dinner, my mother adding pointedly, "We need to have a family talk. It's important." When I arrived, the table was set with their best china. Throughout the meal, the conversation circled phrases like managing the inheritance together, preserving your grandparents' legacy, and making sure everyone benefits fairly. They never said it outright, but every word was a subtle pressure point, meant to remind me that in their eyes, the house and the money were not mine alone. They were family property. I nodded and smiled, giving them no ground, letting them believe I was still the compliant daughter who could be persuaded by a show of familial unity. Other times, my father would call with an unusually cheerful tone, asking if I needed help with maintenance at the house. He knew some contractors who could fix the roof, repaint the porch, or check the wiring. I knew it was an excuse to get people inside, and I would always politely decline, saying I was enjoying learning about property management and wanted to handle it myself. He would pause, then say, half joking, half serious, "Just don't want you to get in over your head and have to call us to bail you out." I would respond with a light laugh, never taking the bait. During this time, I watched them more closely. Sophie began posting vague inspirational quotes on social media about fairness and sharing within a family, sometimes accompanied by photos of my grandparents' house taken from a distance, clearly during one of her drop-by visits. My parents, meanwhile, started reconnecting with distant relatives, as if building a network of support. I heard from an aunt that my mother had been telling people Clara is young and inexperienced. She needs our guidance to make sure she doesn't squander what her grandparents left her. It all painted a clear picture. They were preparing for a move, but they weren't ready to make it yet. They were gathering information, testing my defenses, and building a narrative. I kept my routine unchanged. I continued to visit the house every weekend, tending the garden and airing out the rooms. I continued my work in Havenwood. But in my mind, I knew this was the calm before the storm. They needed time to find what they thought was a legal loophole or to craft a story convincing enough to win sympathy from others. And I needed that same time to watch, to listen, to memorize every subtle shift in their strategy. My silence wasn't passivity. It was observation. I let them believe I was unguarded, that I was still the same Clara from years ago, too lost in her own world to think about protecting her interests. Because when the predator believes the prey is standing still, it draws closer. And that was exactly where I wanted them. That morning, Crestfall Bay lay under a thin veil of mist, with pale sunlight spilling over the front yard, glinting off the damp, fallen leaves that littered the stone walkway. I was wearing an old gray sweater, a broom in hand, leisurely sweeping the leaves into a pile, listening to the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The salty air, the cries of gulls, and the rustle of the broom created a moment of profound peace until the low hum of an engine broke it apart. A familiar dark blue SUV turned into the driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel. I recognized it instantly. It was my parents' car. Before I could even wonder at their unannounced visit, the passenger door swung open and Sophie stepped out, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her face glowing with an air of monumental achievement. My mother followed, clutching a thin manila folder. My father climbed slowly out of the driver's seat, wearing a smile I knew all too well, the one he used just before delivering a verdict. Sophie broke the silence first. "Hey, sis," she said brightly, striding toward me as if we were about to celebrate. "This house is in my name now. Mom and Dad want you to move your things out this week so I can start renovations. I've already got a potential buyer lined up." The words tumbled out in a single, rehearsed breath, as if it were all a settled matter and I was merely being informed of the logistics. I tightened my grip on the broom handle, feeling the cool, smooth wood against my palms, but I kept my expression neutral. My father stepped forward, holding out a sheaf of papers with a crisp blue seal at the bottom, pushing them toward me. "We've been working with a lawyer," he began, his voice taking on a tone of paternal authority. "Turns out there was an old clause in your grandparents' will that wasn't updated after your grandmother passed. Legally, the house should have gone to both of you, but your grandfather overlooked it. We've corrected that clerical error and transferred the ownership to Sophie. It's just simpler for management. You have a place to live, don't you? This is the most reasonable solution." My mother stood beside him, nodding in solemn agreement, her eyes fixed on me with a look that said, "This is for everyone's benefit." I glanced at the papers. I could see they were printed from some online template. The seal looked suspiciously generic, the signatures a little too perfect. And yet, they presented them with such unshakable confidence, as if they expected me to simply nod and acquiesce. A part of me wanted to laugh, but on the surface, I only tilted my head slightly, a faint, curious smile touching my lips. "Really?" My question was quiet, carrying no trace of shock, more like a detached comment on a piece of interesting news. Sophie blinked, momentarily thrown by my calm. "Yes, really. You don't have to worry. I'll handle everything. I figure you can have all your things moved out within a week. I'll hire a crew to clear the place for the renovation. It will all be very smooth." Her voice was edged with excitement, the thrill of a long-awaited victory. My father interjected, his voice softening as if to soothe a child. "Clara, you know this house requires a lot of upkeep. Sophie has the time and a clear plan. You're so busy with your career in Havenwood. Holding on to this place will only be a burden. This is the best way for everyone," my mother added. "Besides, Sophie will share a portion of the sale with you. Won't you, Sophie?" Sophie nodded quickly, though her eyes flashed with the triumphant certainty that she wouldn't have to. I said nothing more. I let the silence hang in the air for a few moments, letting them believe I was actually considering their reasonable solution. In reality, I had been preparing for this exact scene for months. I knew they would arrive with a story woven from half-truths and outright fabrications. I knew they would present documents they believed were legally sound enough to force my hand. And I also knew that today was not the day to reveal my own hand. Instead of arguing, I leaned the broom against the porch railing, wiped my hands on my jeans, and spoke in an even tone. I've heard you. I didn't call them Mom, Dad, or Sophie. The subtle shift in address made Sophie's brow furrow for a second, though she quickly recovered her bright smile. Good, she said, a note of relief in her voice. Then we'll be back soon to get started. I'll call the moving company today. My father folded the papers and slipped them back into his jacket pocket as if the matter was closed. They left after a few more stilted pleasantries, the SUV rolling down the drive and disappearing around the bend, leaving a faint scent of exhaust to mingle with the salt in the air. I stood there for a long moment, watching until the car was gone, a strange sense of calm settling over me. It wasn't the calm of surrender, but the quiet focus of a chess player who sees the entire board. They still saw me as the compliant daughter of their own making, the one who would sacrifice her own rights for the illusion of family harmony. But this time, they were profoundly mistaken. Inside the house, I poured myself a cup of tea, settled into the armchair by the window, and opened my laptop. I sent Marcus a short message. They came. Exactly as we anticipated. Prepare for the next step. 2 days after their confident announcement, the morning in Crestfall Bay began under a thin veil of mist that softened the edges of the world. I had risen early not to pack, but to prepare. The dining room table was cleared, holding only the thick, blue-bound portfolio for the trust, its pages neatly tabbed and organized. On the porch, I had placed an extra chair for my guest, Mr. Davies, a senior official from the county's Office of Property Records. As the clock neared 10, the rumble of a large truck engine sounded from the end of the gravel road. A white moving truck appeared, led by my parents' familiar blue SUV. Sophie jumped out of the passenger seat, dressed in stylish athletic wear, her phone held high as if ready to document her triumph. My father emerged from the driver's side, his smile a mixture of reassurance and control. My mother followed, pointing toward the porch and signaling to the two movers who were already unloading dollies from the truck. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel, their confident chatter cutting through the quiet morning air. But as they reached the walkway, the scene on the porch brought them to an abrupt halt. I stood there, arms folded, beside Mr. Davies. He was dressed in a neat gray suit, his silver-streaked hair combed back. In his hands, he held a thick file, its cover clearly bearing the name of the trust, clipped with several official-looking documents. He didn't speak immediately, waiting until they had drawn closer. When they were just a few feet away, he reached into his jacket, produced his official credentials, and held them up. Am I speaking with Mr. Arthur Thorne, Mrs. Helen Thorne, and Ms. Sophie Thorne? His voice was clear, professional, and carried an unmistakable weight of authority. The three of them exchanged confused glances. My father nodded, his voice tight. Yes. What is this about? Mr. Davies glanced down at his file. I am here on behalf of the county's Office of Property Records to inform you of the legal status of this property. According to our official records, this house and all associated assets were placed into an irrevocable trust on April 12th of last year, with Ms. Clara Thorne as the sole trustee. Any attempted transfer of ownership after that date, including through the documents you possess, is legally void. In this case, it also constitutes an act of fraud. The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. Sophie's triumphant smile vanished, her eyes blinking rapidly as she struggled to process his words. My mother's hand tightened on her folder, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. My father took a half step forward, his voice sharp. Fraud? What fraud? We simply corrected an error in the will. Her grandparents forgot. Mr. Davies cut him off, his tone polite but unyielding. Sir, any such correction made without the legal authorization of the trustee and without following the county's formal process is null and void. Furthermore, our preliminary review indicates that the documents you are relying on were created using an out-of-state service and bear a notary seal that is not registered in the state of Oregon. These are serious irregularities that are sufficient to trigger a criminal investigation. I remained silent, watching their faces crumble. The two movers, who had been lingering at the edge of the porch, exchanged uneasy looks. One of them coughed quietly and took a slow step back toward their truck. Sophie finally found her voice, turning on me. "What are you doing, Clara? We're family." I met her gaze directly, my own voice low and steady. Family doesn't bring forged documents to throw me out of the home our grandparents entrusted to me. Family doesn't hire movers to clear out my belongings without my consent. Mr. Davies continued, his voice calm but every word deliberate. I will be filing an official report of today's events, along with a formal warning. If you return to this property with any further intent to take possession, we will proceed to the next step, which will include contacting the district attorney's office. He handed my father a copy of the official notice, then turned to me. Ms. Thorne, all rights of management and control of this property remain exclusively with the trust, under your authority. My parents and Sophie stood frozen for a few seconds longer, as if hoping for a different outcome. When they saw only my calm, unyielding expression, my father spun on his heel, his voice clipped. "Let's go." Sophie shot me a venomous glare. "You will regret this," she hissed. I answered with only the faintest of smiles, a smile that seemed to unnerve them more than any angry words could have. The movers had practically scurried back to their truck, packing their equipment far more quickly than they had unloaded it. As the SUV and moving truck retreated down the drive, leaving the morning quiet once more, I let out a slow, deep breath. Mr. Davies closed his file, handed me a copy, and said, "They may try again, but today you showed them it won't be easy." I thanked him and walked him to his car. Then I stood on the porch, looking out at the ocean. The waves continued their steady, timeless rhythm, indifferent to the brief, failed siege upon the house. But I knew this was only the opening skirmish. I had won the first battle, but the war for my peace was far from over. 3 days after the confrontation on the porch, I returned to my apartment in Havenwood, trying to immerse myself back into the rhythm of my work. But that Wednesday afternoon, as I arrived home, I found a crisp, cream-colored envelope slipped under my door. The corner bore the name of a Portland law firm, and the neatly typed line Ms. Clara Thorne sent a chill down my spine. Inside was a 4-page letter, printed on heavy bond paper in a formal serif font. The title read, "Formal Demand for Settlement." The sender was my mother's new attorney. I sat down at my kitchen table and read every line. The opening paragraph claimed that my mother, acting on behalf of the family's well-being, was accusing me of violating my moral and emotional obligations by refusing to share my grandparents' estate. Then came the demands: $150,000 in cash as compensation for my mother's emotional distress, joint ownership of the coastal house with Sophie, and a monthly stipend to ensure the family's long-term financial security. The letter argued that my hoarding of the inheritance had caused severe emotional strain and had irrevocably damaged the mother-daughter and sisterly bonds. By the time I finished reading, I felt a strange mixture of weary amusement and cold resolve. Instead of reacting with anger, I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and found the name of the person I knew could dismantle this latest attack. Sonia Patel, an estate and trust litigation specialist Marcus had recommended when I first set up the trust. Sonia was in her early 40s, petite and soft-spoken, but her legal mind was famously sharp. I scheduled a meeting for the next morning at her downtown Havenwood office, bringing both the letter and a copy of my trust documents. The moment I sat down across from her polished desk, Sonia scanned the letter, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. "Clara, this is a classic intimidation tactic. They're betting that you'll panic and fold. What do we do? I asked. Her answer was immediate. First, we send them a cease and desist letter, making it clear their claims are baseless and demanding they stop all harassment. Then, we go on the offensive. Within 2 days, Sonia had drafted the letter. Her tone was impeccably professional yet utterly formidable, affirming the absolute legality of the irrevocable trust, stating that neither my mother nor Sophie had any legal claim, and warning that any further threats or harassment would be met with legal action. The letter was sent via certified mail to my mother's attorney and to her home address in Crestfall Bay. But Sonia didn't stop there. Using the report from Mr. Davies and the information I provided, she began to investigate the fraudulent documents from the moving truck incident. She traced the notary stamp number and, as we suspected, discovered it did not exist in Oregon's official database. By cross-referencing the filing code on the document, she found it had been generated by an out-of-state online service, one that had been flagged in several states for facilitating fraudulent property filings designed to bypass local verification. And the name listed as the filer? Sophie Thorne. When Sonia told me, I felt both a surge of vindication and a deep, chilling sadness. Vindication because we now had irrefutable proof of deliberate fraud. Sadness because my own sister had willingly put her name to a lie in order to steal our grandparents' home. Sonia's voice hardened slightly. With this evidence, if they push any further, we hand this file directly to the district attorney's fraud division. The documents will speak for themselves. I left Sonia's office that day with a copy of the preliminary investigative report, the cease and desist letter already on its way, and a feeling that was entirely new. For the first time in this ordeal, I wasn't just defending. I was pushing back. I knew this wouldn't be the final move, but it was a decisive one. And I knew, on their side, they would not retreat quietly. Just a week after Sonia sent the cease and desist, I began to notice a subtle shift in how some of my relatives spoke to me. An aunt from out of state sent a vague text asking if I was doing okay and whether things were really as bad as Helen said. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years called, his conversation meandering through awkward pleasantries before he finally asked if we could all just find a way to keep the family together. I didn't need long to understand. This was the beginning of a new offensive, one aimed not at my assets, but at me. 2 days later, my suspicion was confirmed when my phone buzzed with a message from Maya, my maternal cousin, one of the few relatives I had always trusted. Clara, I need to see you. Aunt Helen has been telling the whole family things about you. It's not good. We arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between our cities. Maya was already there, sitting in a quiet corner with her laptop open. As soon as I sat down, she turned the screen toward me and pressed play on an audio file. My mother's voice, laced with a practiced, weary sorrow, filled the quiet space between us. I don't want to speak ill of her, but Clara, she took advantage of my father's forgetfulness to get him to sign the papers. He wasn't of sound mind near the end. Everyone knows that. I honestly suspect she manipulated the legal process in ways he didn't fully understand. Maya paused the recording, her eyes meeting mine. She's not just saying this to 1 or 2 people, Clara. That's from a voicemail she left for Uncle Robert. She's also created a group chat with a dozen other cousins to tell and retell this story. I sat in silence, feeling a cold wave wash over me. My mother had escalated her narrative from a property dispute to a story of elder abuse and manipulation. This wasn't just about damaging my reputation within the family. It could have real-world consequences for my career, where trust and integrity are everything. Maya showed me her phone, scrolling through messages from the group chat. Clara was always the selfish one. Grandma and Grandpa would have wanted it split evenly. She's just good at playing the victim. Some had even embellished the story further, suggesting I had tricked my grandfather into signing documents he couldn't read properly. I looked up at Maya and asked, "Do you believe any of it?" She shook her head instantly. "No. I know you. But you have to understand, if she keeps repeating it, the relatives who don't see you often will start to believe it. And in our family, once a story takes root, it's almost impossible to pull it out. Her words were a clear warning. Driving back to Havenwood, I couldn't shake them. This was no longer about them wanting the house or the money. This was an attempt to destroy my character, to recast me as the greedy villain who betrayed her own grandparents. If I let this narrative stand, the social pressure and the chorus of relatives urging me to compromise for the sake of peace would become unbearable. I had seen my mother do this before, isolating anyone who stood in her way. That night, I called Sonia and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "Clara, this is a character assassination campaign. We're no longer just defending your assets. We have to defend your credibility. The good news is you have direct evidence from my recordings, screenshots, the list of everyone in that group chat. In a legal context, that's invaluable proof of malicious intent." We decided that from that moment on, every piece of information would be meticulously documented. Screenshots, audio files, names, dates, and times. When I hung up the phone, it was nearly midnight. Sitting alone in my quiet apartment, I realized this was no longer a simple legal battle. This was a fight for the truth. If I lost control of my own story, then everything my grandparents had left meant just their home, but their honor and my memory of them would be forever tarnished. And I would not let that happen. The next morning, I was in Sonia's office, seated at a long conference table. Spread before us were documents, a portable hard drive, and a laptop displaying a blank document. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Sonia began to type, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "We will not embellish a single thing, Clara," she said, her voice sharp and focused. "Everything will be presented as cold, verifiable fact. Dates, times, sources. Anyone who reads this will know it is the truth, not your version of it." We started with the timeline, the dates of my grandparents' passing, the original contents of the will, the establishment of the irrevocable trust, and the lawfully notarized transfer documents. From there, Sonia methodically laid out the evidence of fraud, high-resolution photographs of the fake notary seal, the official statement from the state confirming the registration number did not exist, and the filing records showing the fraudulent deed had been submitted through the out-of-state online service under Sophie's name. Next came the $150,000 demand letter from my mother's lawyer, its wording so blatant it left no room for interpretation. The final section was the most sensitive, the smear campaign. I provided every screenshot Maya had sent, the audio file of my mother's accusations, and the list of relatives who had been targeted. Sonia transcribed the most damning quotes verbatim. 3 days later, the document was complete. 12 pages long, printed on Sonia Patel's official letterhead, with the clear, unambiguous title, Statement of Facts and Supporting Evidence, The Vance Thorne Family Trust Dispute. We drafted a short, simple email for me to send. To my family. I know there have been many stories circulating recently about me and my grandparents' estate. Before you reach any conclusions, I wanted you to have the opportunity to read the full truth, supported by verifiable evidence. I have attached a statement of facts prepared by my legal counsel. After today, I will not be discussing this matter further. If you choose to believe me, I am grateful. If you do not, that is your choice, but at least it will be a choice based on facts. The recipient list included 27 email addresses and 4 phone numbers for text delivery everyone my mother had contacted. Sonia sent it from her office's secure server to ensure it carried legal weight. When the delivery confirmation appeared, I felt a profound sense of release, as if I had finally set down a heavy burden. The responses came faster than I had imagined. Within 2 hours, my phone was buzzing. A cousin called, his voice heavy with regret. "Clara, I am so sorry. I believed Aunt Helen. But after seeing this evidence, there's nothing to say." And Aunt emailed, "Thank you for sending this. I had a very different impression, and I am sorry for doubting you." Even a cousin who had always been close to Sophie texted, "Now I understand why you've been so quiet. Stay strong." Of course, not everyone was swayed. 3 relatives, all from my father's side, responded with accusations, claiming I was manipulating the story and only presenting one side. But for every one of those, I received 5 messages of support. The most unexpected was a call from my Aunt Carol, who had always doted on Sophie. Her voice trembled. "Clara, I am deeply ashamed. I said things about you I believed your mother. I've just read everything, and I don't know how to apologize enough." I didn't scold her. I simply told her that I hoped she understood why I had to do this. That evening, I sat in my living room, watching the city lights begin to sparkle. Sending that statement wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about breaking the psychological siege my mother had built around me. She had lost control of the narrative. And that meant she and Sophie would be forced to choose their next move. I didn't know whether they would retreat or escalate. But whatever they chose, I was more ready than I had ever been. Once the statement of facts was out, I knew I had regained the moral high ground. But my mother and Sophie's campaign had never been just about reputation. It was about wearing me down until I conceded. To truly end this, I had to show them that every action would now have a clear and unavoidable consequence. And this time, I decided to target something Sophie considered the bedrock of her future, her brand new career in real estate. One evening, I sat in my home office, the glow of my laptop illuminating the thick file I had meticulously compiled. Everything was there: the forged property transfer document with Sophie's name on it, the photo of the invalid notary seal, the official verification from the state, and the record of the online filing. I also included the $150,000 demand letter, Sonia's cease and desist warning, and an appendix quoting the state statutes on attempted property fraud and document forgery. The company Sophie had just joined was a boutique real estate firm in Portland called Summit Realty, known for its polished social media presence and its vocal commitment to professional ethics and transparent transactions. Their website featured a dedicated contact form for reporting ethical violations, along with a pledge to investigate all such reports seriously. This was the door I needed to open. I drafted a short, precise email, attaching the entire case file as a neatly indexed PDF. To the Ethics and Compliance Department at Summit Realty, I am submitting the attached file concerning your new employee, Sophie Thorne. This file contains verifiable evidence of attempted real estate fraud, including falsified documents and the use of an invalid notary seal in an attempt to unlawfully obtain a property valued at over $1.2 million. I believe this information directly pertains to your company's reputation and legal compliance obligations. Sincerely, Clara Thorne. I sent it from a secure email account. As I clicked send, my heart beat a steady, resolute rhythm. I wasn't acting out of vengeance, but from a clear understanding that this was the only way to make the consequences of her actions real. I expected it might take weeks for a response. But just 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from a contact in the Oregon State Real Estate Association. "Clara, word on the street is that Sophie Thorne's employment at Summit Realty has been suspended pending an internal investigation. They've already forwarded the file to the state licensing board." A cool sense of finality washed over me. The next update came that afternoon from Sonia, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "They didn't just fire her, Clara. They sent their findings to the board. And even better, the county has officially filed charges for attempted property fraud and forgery, based on the evidence we provided to Mr. Davies." I leaned back in my chair, watching the gentle Havenwood rain streak down the window pane. The county's notice of charges was sent directly to my mother's address in Crestfall Bay. I knew that the moment that envelope was opened, the entire dynamic of their fight would shatter. Attempted property fraud wasn't just a phrase in a legal document. It was a criminal charge, a permanent stain that would follow Sophie for years, closing nearly every door in her chosen profession. That evening, my phone rang 11 times from the same number, Sophie's. There were no texts, no voicemails, just call after relentless call, as if she could break through my silence with sheer persistence. I didn't answer. I knew that any conversation would be a vortex of blame, pleas, and threats. Instead, I muted my phone, set it face down, and let the sound of the rain fill the quiet space I had fought so hard to reclaim. The next day, Sophie's Instagram featured a black square with white text. Some people will destroy your life and pretend they're the victim. I felt nothing. The people who mattered already knew the truth. 2 months after the charges were filed, the storm finally passed. There were no more late-night calls, no more legal letters, no more whispers from relatives. Then, on a Monday morning, I found a thick white envelope in my mailbox with the return address of a law firm in Salem. Inside was a short, formal letter. Our client, Mrs. Helen Thorne, hereby withdraws all legal claims related to the Vance Thorne Family Trust and the property at 1254 Seaview Bluff Lane, Crestfall Bay, Oregon. Mrs. Thorne further requests that there be no future contact between herself and Ms. Clara Thorne, except where legally necessary. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in my file cabinet. The feeling wasn't triumph, it was closure. A door had been firmly, quietly shut. That afternoon, I drove to Crestfall Bay. The road leading to the house was lined with maple trees, their leaves blazing in shades of crimson and gold. The autumn sun cast a warm, honeyed light over the ocean as I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The house was silent, filled with the scent of old wood and the faint trace of lavender from the sachets my grandmother had tucked into every drawer. I walked down the hall, my fingers brushing against the cool, familiar walls, past the black and white portrait of my grandparents on their wedding day. In my mind, I heard my grandfather's voice, calm and deep. You have to know how to protect what's worth keeping, Clara. Don't expect anyone else to do it for you. I had once thought he was only talking about this house, a physical inheritance. Now I understood he meant something more, my peace, my integrity, my right to define my own life. I stood in the living room as the last light of day streamed through the large window, spilling across the worn rug. In that moment, all the noise of the past months, the accusations, the demands, the threats seemed to dissolve into the quiet air. I was no longer the daughter who had to shrink herself to keep the peace. I no longer carried the guilt for drawing lines with people who used the word family as a license to exploit. What remained was me, steady, whole, and calmer than I had ever been. Some might say I was too harsh, that family is sacred. But I have learned what my grandparents knew all along: love is not a permission slip for cruelty. Setting boundaries is not selfish, it is the highest form of self-respect. It is the only way to end a cycle of disrespect and begin a life of your own making. And if I had to choose between being labeled cold and returning to a place where my worth was conditional, I would choose my own peace, now and always. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sea fade from blue to silver to black under the rising stars. The waves kept their steady, rhythmic beat, like the enduring heart of the house itself. I smiled, not because I had one, but because I had preserved what my grandparents truly intended for me. Not just their house, but myself, defined by no one, owned by no one. And in the cool, salty air of the evening, I whispered, as if they could hear me, I kept it safe. Just like I promised.